Chapter reading of Alpha Goldberg's Pentagon 9/11 book, Chapter 7, Defense Protective Service. The DPS, led by Chief John Jester, have responsibility for security and law enforcement on the Pentagon reservation. Approximately 250 armed officers trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia patrolled the building and grounds, guarded entrances, screened deliveries, responded to bomb threats, formed an emergency response team, commonly known as a Special Weapons and Tactics Team, and staffed the Protective Services unit that guarded the Secretary of Defense and other high-ranking DoD officials and visiting dignitaries. The DPS also supervised contract security guards at 45 Department of Defense leased facilities around the National Capital Region. Additionally, some 50 unarmed DPS members operated locksmith and building pass offices and had responsibility for installing and maintaining alarms and intrusion detection devices, securing classified material, and promoting industrial and information security. The Pentagon required extensive security arrangements around the clock to protect not only the people in the building, but also command and control operations, communication equipment, and a vast number of classified documents. You can see the Department of Defense spared no measure here regarding the safety and security of the people in the building, with the Pentagon actually being attacked just a day earlier. Right away, they meant to secure the building with armed and unarmed personnel. To safeguard foreign official visitors, DPS worked with the United States Secret Service, the Department of State, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Whenever the Pentagon became the target of protest demonstration, DPS coordinated with civilian and military agencies in the region, managing the flow of 100,000 tourists who visited the building each year. Also required coordination with other agencies. During the 1980s and 1990s, DPS studied the lessons learned from truck bombings against Americans abroad and at home. Despite the steep costs, Jester and others strongly advocated incorporating as part of the Pentagon renovation such changes as blast-proof windows, a remote facility for truck deliveries, blast wall between south parking and the building, moving the Metro bus terminal further from the structure, and rerouting the exit path from the Metro train station. All measures eventually carried out. Take note that the blast-proof windows here, this was actually talked about in the 60 Minutes episode, that this came from the bombing of the Oklahoma City building, the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma. And this actually came from the FBI. When the FBI's Pentagon FBI head contact, Chris Combs, met with the Pentagon Incident Commander from Arlington, Assistant Fire Chief James Schwartz, they spoke about, with the Pentagon renovation team headed by Lee Evey, about inserting blast-proof windows, because what they found in Oklahoma City was a lot of victims, deceased and alive, shredded by the windows of the building when the blast happened. And a lot of the bodies were charred by the glass. So what they wanted was to put in blast-proof windows. And that's what saved a lot of lives at the Pentagon. And you could see that episode. I believe I have it uploaded on my channel. If not, I will soon. But that was a key issue about the Pentagon itself and why some windows, even with the plane crashing into it, for the exception of the impact area, some of those windows actually survived. But the ones who were in the way of the impact did not, obviously. The 1995 Naran serve gas attack at the Tokyo subway prompted DPS to initiate planning to counter a terrorist chemical or biological attack on the Pentagon. So DPS actually is very key, instrumental in the 20 years prior to the 9/11 attacks about securing the building from, say, guerrilla-style terrorist attacks. But what they weren't prepared was a martyrdom-style attack using planes as weapons. Now, I'm not going to get into that here. We all know that during 1995, with the Pachinko plot, that there was a threat to airliners by martyrdom radical extremists. They knew this 6 years prior to 9/11, that airliners would be used to attack the United States sensitive areas. It wasn't like it came out of nowhere. The reports went to the FAA, went to the FBI, and nobody prepared for it. For Exercise Cloudy Office in 1998, DPS employed a scenario in which Sarah was released after terrorist breach security, reached the office of the Secretary of Defense, and took hostages. The exercise participated in by 500 people from the local, state, and federal agencies, killed 26 people and contaminated 100 at the Pentagon. By 2001, however, DPS had made little progress in acquiring chemical and biological detection equipment, a key component of its counterterrorism planning. As you can see, when the Exercise Cloudy Office opened in 1998, 2001, 3 years later, they still didn't get the necessary equipment. You wonder why. I mean, we can always theorize and speculate why, but we really don't know. Did they have enough money? Was there enough allocation of funds to this program? And were allocation of funds headed to programs that basically were a waste of money? I don't know. I really don't know. Because the Pentagon lay in the flight of the Reagan National Airport, the 16th busiest in the country, DPS also considered the possibility of the crash of an airplane to building, an event it thought more likely to be accidental than deliberate. In 2000, DPS held a tabletop exercise with a scenario of a single engine aircraft hitting the roof and bursting into flames. This is true. It was called it was Operation Mascal, Mass Casualty, MASCAL. In October of 2000, DPS actually worked with the Department of Defense in how agencies would come on site in time. So basically, it was about preparation for a airplane style crash into the Pentagon from the rooftop, like if the plane actually considered if the plane malfunctioned. But what they didn't prepare was for a martyrdom attack. That's what they didn't prepare for, even though the information was out there. During these exercises, DPS regarded the Arlington County Fire Department as the first responder since it normally served the Pentagon for fire and medical incidents. And actually, Arlington and Fort Myer arrived first on September 11th. Arlington officials introduced DPS to the Incident Command System. On the other hand, although the Arlington Police were the law enforcement and security arm for the firefighting incident commander, they did not have jurisdiction on the Pentagon reservation. Chief Edward Flynn of the Arlington County Police Department and Jester, however, knew each other well as members of the Police Chiefs Committee of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. Membership in the committee afforded Jester opportunities to get to know his counterparts throughout the region. On September 11th, Jester at his desk in room 4A275 received a telephone call from Glenn Flood, a public affairs specialist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, alerting him to the first strike in New York City. Turning on his television, he saw United Flight 175 plunge into the second tower. When Lieutenant Michael Nesbitt, who ran the day-to-day operations at the DPS command center on the first floor, telephoned the chief asking if he knew of the New York plane crashes, Jester directed him to send a message to the building's real estate and facilities directorate, reassuring that all the Pentagon remained secure. Its terrorist threat condition stayed at normal, meaning no present threat of terrorist activity, terrorist threat condition, renamed Terrorist Force Protection Condition in June 2001, a term not yet widely used in September 2001, ranged from normal to 4 higher levels, Alpha through Delta. No one in DPS received warning of a hijacked aircraft on its way to the Washington area. That's because Flight 77 was not reported to be hijacked until after it crashed into the Pentagon. FAA has a lot of blame here, as well as NORAD, because NORAD basically gave testimony in 9/11 Commission stating that even if they would not be able to stop the plane in time. However, according to Colonel, I forgot his name just now, Larry Arnold. Colonel Larry Arnold basically testified before the 9/11 Commission stating that if they had gotten information just in time, they probably couldn't. However, Commander Ralph Eberhart, basically gave testimony saying that if they gotten information on time, they could have intercepted all the planes. NORAD basically gave a false timeline tonight on the commission report and basically really didn't tell the truth. And the FAA just looked like a bunch of bumbling idiots. No one in DPS received warning of a hijacked aircraft on its way to Washington area. Reacting to the news from New York City, Army Deputy Administrative Assistant Sandra Riley telephoned Jester and asked, "What do we have in place to protect from an airplane?" He replied, "Nothing." The Pentagon did not have an anti-aircraft system on the roof of the building or on the grounds. Even if DPS had received word of an inbound plane, it had no plans to counter a suicide air attack. Had a warning been issued in time, DPS's only effective response would have been evacuation and dispersal of the building's occupants. As you can see, the rumor that there was surface-to-air missiles at the Pentagon is false. There are none. A surface attack was a different matter. After reviewing contingency plans and procedures for tightening security with DPS Major James Phillips, Jester proceeded to the offices of Doc Cook, head of the Washington Headquarters Services, and Paul Hasselbush, Jester's immediate supervisor and director of real estate and facilities. He informed them of DPS procedures to beef up patrols outside the building and impose stricter security checks at entry points. Before returning to his office, Jester met with Deputy Chief John Purgard and discussed the tighter security arrangements. He directed Purgard to notify the DPS Communications Center to raise the force protection condition to Alpha, meaning that a general threat of possible terrorist activity existed, which required enhanced security. Purgard held the phone in his hand, dialing the center when Flight 77 hit. He heard the crash more than felt it. And again, we still have people who don't believe a plane crashed in the Pentagon. Is everyone here lying? And if so, can you prove that they're lying? I mean, at this point, there should be no planes. It's 2024. It really is embarrassing that we have people like this. When the phone call was answered, he could hear the center's alarms activating and radio calls taking place. The dispatcher yelled, "We've been hit. We've been hit. Wedge one. DPS officer Mark Bright, who was standing outside the building, saw the plane fly low over the Navy Annex and slam into the building. Is he lying? He radioed in his report, sped in his police cruiser to the crash site, and called in for a description of the scene. Other officers also radioed the center. In his office about 600 feet from the crash, Jester thought the shaking and loud noise was caused by a heavy load of furniture on a pallet rolling over an uneven expansion joint. He heard someone yell, "We've been hit." First thought was, not here. It can't happen here. He looked out the window, saw smoke, ran down the stairs to the communication center and shouted, "Get a camera up there." Some of the center's 8 monitor screens mounted on a wall remained blank because the crash had destroyed the camera nearest the impact site and cut connectivity to others. One monitor came on automatically, showing debris and doors blown open off their hinges in Corridor 5. Officer Jesse DeVaughn brought up an image for a camera at the Navy Annex that had zoomed in on the broiling red flames and smoke. Nesbitt thought he was looking at the nearby gas station on South Joy Street, so he called to notify the Arlington County Fire Department of reports that a plane hit the Pentagon. He also reported a fire at the gas station. Nesbitt then refocused an Annex camera to clearly show a normal gas station scene and the blaze at the Pentagon. In the meantime, Jester told Nesbitt to use the public address system to order everyone to evacuate, but not to use corridors 3 and 4. The chief ran to the center court, then over to A&E Drive, where he saw black smoke and raging flames. With others, he tried to enter the building, but the intense heat forced them back. He heard shouts about windows ready to blow. Jester ran back to the communication center and told Nesbitt, "Mike, you've got to get fire or somebody in here because people are trapped. They're burning alive." Jester ran out to A&E Drive again, heard people shouting for fire extinguishers, and directed DPS officers to find some. But he feared the equipment could do little against the horrible flames he had just seen and felt. The officers found extinguishers in a remote delivery facility and brought them to A&E Drive. Moving on to the Senate Court for a while, Jester tried to gather information and coordinate DPS activity, then headed for the impact site on the west side of the building, arriving after the E-Fing floors had collapsed on 10/15. Although smoke began to filter into the communication center, DPS personnel remained at their posts, communicating with the ACFD and agencies with medical evacuation helicopters and responding to and monitoring calls while utilizing 11 phone lines. Knowing that a move to the untested offsite backup center further from the building could disrupt DPS communications for nearly an hour and might even result in a long-term disconnect, they were determined to remain in place and function into the DPS communications hub. The thickening smoke and warnings about another hijack were on its way to the area. Immediately after the crash, DPS officers rushed to the devastated area to rescue people. Officers Fred Hodges and Mark Baker left their police cruiser near the crash site and ran to help terrify people fleeing the inferno. It seemed like an eternity before the fire trucks arrived, but it was only 5 minutes, Hodges recalled. Officer David Webster pedaled his bike from the Pentagon Metro bus area to the impact site, where he helped people exit corridors 5 and 6. He met Master Police Officer George Clodfelter, who, with Officer Jose Rojas, pulled victims from the building near the heliport. One of these had hair and clothes on fire. Officer Arthur Rosati plunged into the smoke in the hallway to grab a guide, a lieutenant colonel, to safety. On meeting Clodfelter, who had blood all over his shirt, he heard him say, "This is insane." From the remote delivery facility, Officer James Murphy and K-9 officers Isaac Hoopy ran to the building, entering it through the double doors at the heliport entrance. They attempted to move deeper into the first floor, but smoke and heat drove them back. Murphy then ran to a window and pulled people out. Hoopy re-entered the structure at a different point to carry people to safety. The heavy smoke caused some victims to lose their bearings, but the calming instructions from Hoopy guided them to safety. In one pitch-dark room with smoke, William Sinclair, with severely burned hands and arms, heard Hoopy say over and over, "If you can hear me, head toward my voice," which he did. Sinclair called Hoopy his guardian angel. Officers Bruce Center and WTT Carpenter joined other rescuers in the Indian Drive, leading injured survivors to safety and operating fire extinguishers to help others out the building. DPS Major James Kobar, Investigator Robbins Mapp, and 2 Virginia State troopers entered the building from the heliport side, braving the smoke and heat to help dazed and injured people escape from the destruction. Korber had rushed to the scene from the Navy Annex with officers Michael Benedict and John Kinnard. Despite the threat of a building collapse, Matt Kobar and the troopers removed debris, called out the survivors, searched halls and rooms. One on the 4th floor above the aircraft entry hole, when smoke and heat disoriented one of the troopers, officers Don Behe and Abraham Diaz took him out of the Pentagon to paramedics and sent him to the hospital. Increasingly dangerous conditions also forced the others to leave the building shortly before the floors collapsed. Duty required many DPS personnel to remain at their posts within the building and at main entrances during and after the evacuation. Officers William McNeil, Richard Brown, and James Griggs, among those protecting the National Military Command Center, and other JCS officers, could respond only with makeshift, barely effective means when the smoke reached them. McNeil used wet paper towels on his mouth and nose to filter out the smoke. Offered a dust mask, Brown readily donned it for the meager protection it offered. Griggs relied on wet tissues to breathe through and to soothe his irritated eyes. Although often at risk, no DPS officers were killed or seriously injured on September 11th. Unfortunately, Alan Boyle, a DPS contract worker installing alarms at Wedge 1, had apparently taken a break on the west side of Corridor 4 and was close to the impact point and perished. DPS and the Pentagon Building Management Office had responsibility for the orderly evacuation of the approximately 20,000 military and civilian personnel, contractors, vendors, and visitors in the building. They conducted periodic fire drills and provided floor plans, exit routes, and guidance about evacuations. Each organization had to select its own assembly area and publicize its exit paths. In the unrenovated wedges, frequent false alarms accidentally triggered by maintenance work had often led to occupants not leaving until they received confirmation of a fire or other incident. On August 16, 2001, Cook reported to Department of Defense senior managers that a few days earlier, while a fire burned in the cafeteria, some people ignored alarms and DPS evacuation directions. He stressed the importance of emergency response training for DoD personnel and urged managers to consult the circular recently issued by the building management explaining supervisory responsibilities in the event of a fire or other dangerous situations. For the new recently occupied Wedge 1, an evaluation after September 11th found that many survivors said that they were not aware of evacuation plans for the areas of the building in which they worked, and that there had been no drills during the period of time that they occupied their new space. Since a local fire was not thought to warrant the evacuation of the entire building, fire alarm systems in renovated Wedge 1 and the unrenovated Wedge 2 through 5 were not designed to sound throughout the entire structure. The explosion and fires destroyed or damaged some alarms. Others automatically activate. Alarms in corridors on the upper side of the building for the crash site did not automatically activate. Occupants and DPS officers set those off manually. DPS personnel and building maintenance workers also entered alarm control rooms near the building apexes and activated alarms for an entire wedge. A pre-recorded voice evacuation message and an alarm sounded in new and old wedges. but in the old wedges, the message was often unintelligible. In addition, DPSs patched together big voice public address systems, allowing an officer to issue a specific exit instructions during the evacuation. They did not amplify well or reach all parts of the building. In some parts, it was difficult or impossible to understand. And as you can see, the old parts of the Pentagon, except for Wedge 1, which was fully renovated and destroyed by the plane, basically did not have necessary or even up-to-date personnel evacuation measures or technical apparatuses to basically warn people of a danger or a threat to their lives. Sometimes some of these things work, sometimes they did not. And this is what, it's funny because the Department of Defense is basically one of the biggest waste spenders in American when it comes to financing. And yet their building is a decrepit mess. Goes to figure that they spend billions of dollars on up-to-date weapons to destroy other countries, but yet in their own country, they're falling apart, just like the American people. Jester wanted the entire building evacuated except for critical command sites, knowing that some people could not hear or understand the alarms or might even ignore them if they were unaware of the plane crash. Purgard instructed the staff of the Security Services branch to join armed force officers to pound on doors and enter offices from the 5th floor to the basement, ordering everyone to leave. Locked emergency doors at the mall and river entrances required people to find other routes. Deputy Secretary Paul Wolfowitz directed the guard to open the emergency door near the river entrance that became an exit route. Officers unlocked the mall emergency door as well. By and large, the massive evacuation directed by DPS was orderly, but emotions ran high, obviously. Some people in South Parking were dazed and crying. On the Riverside D.C. Harbor Patrol Officer Jeffrey Blevins observed everybody was running out. The first group that we were dealing with were the ones that were just kind of a shock. They didn't know what was going on. They just knew that there was an explosion. Army Colonel Bruce Bacchus heard people yelling and screaming as they ran past him. John Irby, head of the Federal Facilities Division, observed out in the corridor. You could see the terror on people's faces as they left. There was no question that it was not a drill. People with disabilities received help that they needed it. Most got out with little difficulty. DPS could not help the many Pentagon evacuees who carried wireless telephones, but could not send their calls through the communication networks. Local television reporter David Starter referred to the situation as cellular gridlock. Navy Lieutenant James McDonough noted that about 15 to 20 people using his phone tried unsuccessfully to make connections. Sometimes if a call got through, the caller would ask others in the crowd if they wanted to send a message to a relative via a third party. Army Major Carl Jolly reached his sister in Seattle and gave her a list of names and phone numbers to call on behalf of others. Army Colonel Mark Volk's wife received a call from a stranger telling her that her husband was fine, that the caller could not talk at length because she had no continuing contact people on the list. Telephones connected to wires functioned much more reliably than cell phones. People formed long keeks at payphones, such as those in the Pentagon City shopping mall, to await their turn to call family, friends, and supervisors. Jester moved through the crowd to meet Incident Commander James Schwartz at South Parking and walked with him to South Hay Street under the I-395 overpass, where Schwartz set up his command post to elude the second hijacked airliner reportedly headed toward the Pentagon. Man in motion the rest of the day. Jester went back and forth between the I-395 location and the crash site when he was not in the Pentagon at DPS Communication Center or providing status briefings for Rumsfeld, Cook, and others. Major Corber, who eventually arrived at the I-395 command post during Jester's absence, functioned as the DPS liaison with the incident commander. Purgard stayed in the center court as the police liaison with Fire Battalion Chief Dale Smith, and Jester had ordered the recall of all off-duty officers. Many rushed to the Pentagon without a recall message, but massive traffic jams delayed their arrival. Once there, heavy smoke in the armory made it difficult to retrieve service weapons. After the attack, DPS raised the force protection condition to Delta, the highest level. Officers took maximum security measures. And that's the end of this chapter reading of Pentagon 9/11 by Alpha Goldberg. Thank you very much for tuning in, taking an interest. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Take care.